Welcome everybody to TNMCoaching Unplugged and Zoran Todorovic Interconnected podcast. We are recording pre-Christmas, so we're festive, we're happy, we're going to have laughter, we're going to have jollies, we're going to have jingle bells. I think I have jingle bells somewhere around here. And we're going to talk about podcasts. We're going to open this big topic because a lot of the people nowadays, record podcasts, they appreciate podcasts as a medium, but what really makes a good podcast? What is that essence that people are looking for, that they want to receive, and how is that communicated forward to the audience so they can feel the benefit of the speaker and they can feel empowered, elevated, and inspired with their knowledge, with the content and what they present. And today we have Jo Youle. She's a creative audio specialist who makes podcasts for different industries, from creativity to the wellness, to the music brands. She helps people curate and understand how to create powerful podcasts as well. In her background, she's a freelance journalist. She was a radio presenter for more than 20 years, and she has hosted different programs, from the news program to current affairs program to her own dance music show. So she has experience to talk to us about podcasts. Jo, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, and look at you, for the people who are seeing you on the YouTube, because some people listen on the Spotify. Most of us listen on the Spotify. But come and look at the YouTube, how Jo looks today. Sparkles, like sparkly and beautiful. Are you feeling like that as well?
Well, we've actually just about to go into our Christmas lunch here at the Hub, the co-working space that I work at. So I thought, it is that time of year. One must sparkle at least once in the festive season. So today is your lucky day, Zoran. I'm feeling sparkly.
Oh, I love that. I should have thought about it. I'm saving myself from the next week when the Christmas begins. I also host a big Christmas party that you're going to be part of, hopefully, and then I'm going to do all the jingles and sparks. Right now, I'm quite conservative, but it's okay.
I'm looking forward to your Christmas party very much.
So, to begin with, what got you into radio? What was the passion, because you're a radio presenter and you had hosted your own show and you were presenting current affairs and the news. What was the love or the passion that got you into this medium to start with?
I think it's just because I've got a great face for radio. That's what people tell me. I'm just kidding.
No, I'm not laughing.
That's what they tell me. That's why I took the almighty switch from working on TV initially. I went to work directly after university. I went to work at CNN International. And actually, for a long time, I was pretty obsessed with just broadcast media of any format, really, and was really excited about the idea of being like a foreign correspondent. That was my dream. I wanted to be Kate Adie when I was a child. And luckily, I actually came to my senses and realized that was just a terrible idea. And I actually, I don't think necessarily putting your life on the line to actually report live from the front line, particularly something that any of us need to do in this lifetime. And so that idea kind of went out the window, really. And I got my job at CNN International. I absolutely loved it. But I think there's a lot of egos in TV, which, there is in the media in general. We've all got one, I suppose. But I feel like somehow taking that visual element out of the mix and going into the world of radio for me was, just something I'd experienced as a child, really, like all throughout my childhood. My dad always had the radio on. My mum always had the radio on the drive to work. And I feel like this idea of, the Imaginarium, really, of your own mind, or one of my editors used to call it the theatre of radio. This idea that you can conjure up these images and there's almost like a mini movie like playing in your mind's eye as you listen to something. And for me, I find that a bit more exciting, really, than just being presented with images and taking something literally. You have more opportunity to be creative with audio because obviously, you're taking somebody on a journey and you're trying to encapsulate a certain environment or a certain landscape or a certain scenario or a certain situation through audio, which for me, when you're not actually physically presenting somebody with the visual facts, there's a lot more opportunity to play and to create a certain scene and then set the scene. And I think that's just for me, much more exciting than working in television and dealing with a lot of the very cutthroat world of TV. I mean, literally, I felt like people would have stepped over their own grandmother to get up the next rung on the TV ladder. And I found that quite terrifying on a daily basis. I didn't enjoy that experience at all, not one bit. So radio felt like a more friendly, welcoming kind of environment.
Yeah, I worked on TV as well, but I was really lucky at that time because I was the only one specialized in that domain, in that topic. So I didn't struggle that much to kind of progress within the television career. But I know it was, for me, also challenging. And also a lot of egos on TV. You know, I remember myself being egocentrical on TV and looking myself at camera and, you know, seeing that how amazing and how special I was and so on and so forth. So it does bring that, you know, struggle with your own ego. You know, how do you manage yourself when you are on the stage? Yeah, when other people are looking at you, isn't it?
I mean, I think it's a deeply uncomfortable, weird thing for most people. I mean, even just sitting here staring at myself down the camera is quite weird. You know, I'm just analysing how many wrinkles I've got and these deep crevices around my eyes. Yeah, it's a human, you know, it's a humanism that we all sit there kind of like, you know, evaluating our external value. And I think that that's no bad thing in some kinds of worlds, but I think it's deeply abnormal and strange, this world that we've entered now, where everybody is a YouTube narrator, or they've got their own channel, and everybody's a presenter of some description these days. And, you know, in many respects, I think it obviously allows anybody to tell a story and to go into that world and have something to say and express what they want to communicate with the world, which is a beautiful thing, obviously, for businesses and brands and that type of thing. But it's, you know, there's a lot of people that just should not be on podcasts or on TV. And I think it's, you know, it's a strange phenomena that we've kind of stepped into in some respects. And make of it what you will. It's a very expanding platform, and it's not going to end anytime soon, I don't think.
Yeah, it's interesting. And this is the reason why I actually wanted to talk to you about the podcast as well, because, you know, radio is radio. I loved radio as well. I was like you, listening to the radio throughout my childhood, you know, using my imagination. Even today, when I'm driving and listening to the radio, it feels like an inner dialogue with myself and with the presenter, and my mind expands and I can visualize and use the imagery of my own imagination to really make sense and to also absorb the information. So I love it. And then somehow radio moved into the podcast. For the people who are kind of new to the podcasting or understanding podcast, do you see any distinction between radio show and podcast? And what is the difference? Or is it all the same?
I mean, obviously, the most obvious thing to state there is that, you know, people have become more discerning about the ways that they listen to audio. So obviously, when you've got a podcast, you can listen to it whenever and wherever you like. Obviously, radio is, you know, potentially probably live, unless it's obviously been pre-recorded, like many of the Christmas shows coming up, for example. I think, you know, it's very exciting to do live radio, for starters. I mean, those were literally the happiest memories that I actually have in my entire history of broadcasting. Going in to the breakfast news studio, was always doing breakfast stuff, which was obviously a nightmare because you used to have to get up at like 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning and then try and be bright-eyed and happy and bushy-tailed, which is when you kind of physically, literally have to like hit your on button in the morning and be like, yes, I am going to be the happiest woman alive for the next 2 hours of my life, or pretend I am. So yeah, it was, you know, exciting and brilliant. And, you know, there's a lot of people around, you're in a part of a team, there's producers, there's researchers, there's somebody there driving the desk, there's a lot of staff around. Obviously, as a podcaster, you're like a one-man band. There's nobody, unless you've got a big fat budget and a lovely sponsor chipping in, maybe like Russell Brand, for example. It's a lonely old path to take as a podcaster, that you've got to do all of your own research, you've got to do all of your own production work, you've got to do all of that, you know, masterminding of the actual physical end product. And I think that's, you know, not to be underestimated. It's a massive, massive, massive commitment, unless you've got buckets of cash to pay somebody to do it for you. It is a lot of work. And, you know, to do that extremely well, I think takes a lot of planning. And not a lot of people seem to kind of wrap their head around that before embarking on such a journey. I think, you know, if you're going to stick your flag in the sand and say, right, I'm going to start a weekly podcast like I have done, it's a lot of work to keep up with that. You know, you feel like you're on this constant little hamster wheel. And, you know, that's something that you really need to have a good, long, hard think about in advance. Obviously, in terms of the going back to the radio example again, I think that radio is polished. It's very polished. It's very well produced. As I said, there's a lot of hands on deck making that so. And with a podcast, perhaps that's, less the case. And it's very obvious when you switch on a podcast within the first 60 seconds or less sometimes, you basically switch it straight back off again because you're like, okay, I do not want to listen to that bad quality. I don't want to listen to that person's voice. I'm not enjoying the subject matter. It isn't quite what I thought it was going to be about. Obviously description and giving somebody the details of what's going to be in that production is extremely important. But, you need to describe things exactly the way that they are and be very creative with that as well. So I think, they are two very different beasts. But of course, video killed the radio star. I think there's a lot of people starting their podcast because they've, admired a particular presenter or somebody in the past or their whole lives, and suddenly they want to emanate that sound and that environment. And I don't think that it's quite as easy as one might think.
So without challenging all the podcasters, including myself, around the quality of their production, and without stifling them to engage into this creative journey of producing and communicating and expressing themselves using this media, how can we do it in a way that still maintains quality? Because for me, as you said, the podcast that I'm listening to, I require a certain level of quality. I require a certain level of sound. I require a certain level of quality of the presenters, quality of the topics, how the interview or conversation is being set up. So a lot of the people I know are sensitive to quality, and then we keep on producing and producing and producing and producing. So for the people who are really considering, saying, I really would love to do this, how can they do it so that this quality can be present within the production?
I think the number one thing I would say is, be prepared or prepared to fail. Ultimately, unless you have your A game on and you have basically mapped out the first 8 episodes at the very minimum before you even launch and produce them. For example, if you're going to go weekly, if you've never done this before, you're not going to be able to lay that gauntlet down for yourself and continue to carry that baton forward. It's a huge commitment. It's a lot of work. And to get some high quality material so that people, stay with you for the whole journey takes a little bit of preparation. So, you need a decent quality microphone for starters. You need to have, a bit of a structure going on, perhaps a little introduction, maybe a little clip or a snippet of something that's coming up in the episode. I think that's the number one way to suck somebody into your narrative. It's give them a little taste of what's to come. If you just start chatting on the beginning of the podcast about what you've been up to that day and how you're feeling and what's been happening in your world, that's not going to drag somebody into the guest that's coming up afterwards. A lot of people do that, and they have that little intro of what's happening in their lives, and it's just not very interesting. I think you really need to grab somebody right at the very start. So, a little planning about the introduction, a little planning about, the recording. Obviously, the material and the equipment that you're going to use is extremely important. And also the way that you're going to weave that all together, maybe with a bit of soundscaping, maybe with a bit of scene setting, maybe with some sound effects, maybe with some theme music. I had the added advantage of 25 years of making radio before I embarked upon putting out a podcast. And I think one of the things that I did do, as I said before, was I was on a breakfast news program as a breakfast reporter. So I had to go out every day and make these little mini shorts to go into the news. So, I was recording sound effects. I was recording the sound of my feet. I was going into the tube station. I was vox popping people on the streets. I was constantly thinking of creative ways to drag somebody into my world. And that's what audio is all about. So it's not to say that 2 people sitting in a studio is not okay. But I think, the time has come when I started out and there's probably only about 100,000 podcasts out there. There's now more than 3 million. So how are you going to set yourself aside from all the other 3 million podcasts? You're going to have a little bit sexy. You're going to have to come up with something that's a little bit different to all the rest of the podcasts. And I think there's an oversaturation going on. It wasn't always like that, even before the pandemic. But now we've got this situation where we've got a lot to choose from. And how does somebody wade through the quagmire and find you? And if the first 60 seconds are bad quality, not very interesting, not telling me what's going to happen in that episode and making me feel like, ooh, that's definitely something I'm going to wait for, then I think you're on a losing battle.
Yeah, exactly. And it's important, for people to understand when they get into that game, what is necessary for the success to happen, because a lot of people start recording, even if they're charismatic, they can capture the audience, they have a format. Then if they don't have the audience, they lose the enthusiasm because they see that the rating is not good, nobody's listening, they're struggling getting sponsorship. So how can somebody get sponsorship in podcasts? This is something that people ask me a lot in the coaching sessions when the new brands actually, or the new podcasters, especially the young ones, come through. They want to monetize it. So what do you think is necessary for any brand to consider sponsoring a podcast?
Well, if I knew the answer to that, Zoran, I'd be lying on the beach in the Cayman Islands, not sitting here talking to you. I think a pina colada.
Well, maybe make a magicalize something together right now. Maybe this question is going to open the doorway for both you and me. And maybe, we're going to get sponsors immediately after this episode. Let's give our best.
Possible. I mean, the manifestation of pre-Christmas is strong.
Yes.
I think ultimately, it's all about the ROI. What is that sponsor going to get from piggybacking your episode? No one, obviously people come on my courses. I run some podcast courses here at the Hub where I'm sitting right now, normally once every other month. And they say to me when they sit here on the course, oh, how am I going to get a sponsor? Just like they do to you. And I say, well, if which came first, the chicken or the egg? Ultimately, without an established audience and with nothing to offer a sponsor, people, Father Christmas is obviously a fictitious character. Let's be honest here that no one's going to come along with a sack of cash and just throw it at you and there you go, darling. Would you like to make a podcast? I'll give you 50K. It's not going to happen. You need to actually have something, very unique. Have an incredible production team or the knowledge to actually produce something of extremely high quality. And it's got to be something that the market needs, pumping out something that is already in existence. Obviously, there's certain fields like the wellness genre, for example, and there's a lot of entrepreneurial, businessy kind of podcasts. You've got people like Stephen Bartlett absolutely smashing it with the Diary of a CEO, for example, and he's got plenty of sponsorship and obviously buckets of cash, probably from his own personal investment schemes. And he's also been in trouble for not really announcing his sponsorships and being a bit sneaky. So, I think it is possible, it is doable, but the first thing you need to do is make a strategic plan to launch and to get traction. No sponsor is going to come along and sponsor something with, 50 listeners and no Instagram account and no socials. And, you need to think about, okay, who can I get on this podcast that's got a massive following and is going to share it? So if you've got some celeb friends, you've got some successful characters in your immediate social circle, that is how you're going to get that out there. And that is how it's going to spread like wildfire, go viral, ideally. And then maybe a sponsor might consider coming on board. But I don't think that that's very easy to do right from the get-go. It's something that takes a lot of application, tenacity, commitment, continuity, and friends in high places. That's basically what it boils down to, I'm afraid.
Yeah, friends in high places. I remember for my podcast, I was I was following exactly what you were saying, producing and niching into the audience, understanding who is listening, who is not listening, what is interesting, what is boring, what are the topics, and then branching into different domains. And then I've recorded a podcast with Ishmael Peretz, who had a huge followership, and it was completely departing from what we were talking about on my podcast. But I just got very curious about his book, which was Our Galactic Origin, because I shared the passion in understanding where we really come from. Who are we as a human being? And that was just an interest of mine. It was not linked to the podcast. And we recorded the podcast, and because he had such a strong followership, immediately in a day, it was 500,000 people listening to it. And then, the podcast kind of really got, highlighted. And then the serious followership actually began happening on Spotify and other media. But I can say from my personal experience, what you're saying, that this one moment in the production with one, even not celebrity, but he was just followed in the social media, really helped a lot, and then people begin listening to different episodes as well. So it was interesting to experience that, like, wow, what happened here now suddenly, Yeah.
Yeah. It's really unexpected and unchartable. We're still in quite uncharted territory. I mean, podcasting is only like 15 years old compared to radio, and people have been stabbing around in the dark for the last sort of 5 years, not having a real clue what they're doing. And when I made my very, very, very first podcast back in 2006, pretty much when podcasting began, Twitter had literally only just, become a thing. Obviously, it's called X now, I believe. And I think that is the number one way that we grew our music news, daily music news download for BBC Six Music. So I was working there as a music journalist, and it absolutely worked. That was the biggest and best possible tool, tagging all the different people in all the different segments of the podcast and throwing that out there twice a day. We made one in the morning, one in the evening. Wow. And it was, a very regular, very reliable. There was never a day where we didn't churn one out Monday to Friday. And people loved that. They loved to know when it's coming, what time it's coming, what it's going to sound like. Has it got the same familiarity at the beginning? Has it got the same continuity? Have I got the same sexy, warm voice that I listened to earlier on? What kind of stories are going to come up there? Obviously, we had these lovely headlines, and we had those little snippets in the headlines as well. And I think that really helped. It was only like a 4 or 5 minute podcast. It wasn't like going to chew up buckets of your time. It's something you can download and listen on the tube, 5 minutes later as you're actually trying not to stare at the person opposite you. And I think it's, it really worked for those reasons. And I think, all these podcasts from these particularly men, I'm sorry to say it, but they are so self-indulgent. All these who wants to listen to a podcast for 3 hours? It's not even interesting. It's terrible. It's just not something I would ever do, Zoran. I'm sorry. I just don't know who does that.
No. I'm trying to keep it short. I have one of the podcasters that I love, in the wellness industry. I'm not going to mention his name, and his podcast is 3 hours. And everyone will start listening to this podcast. I'm like, come on, please.
You're not interesting. You're not that funny. Sorry. I mean, Joe Rogan, there's one. Rich Roll, there's the Lifestyle podcast with Luke, somebody or other. And these are all 3-hour productions. Obviously, when you stop listening to a podcast, the way Apple or Spotify works is it puts a little bookmark there. And the next time you come back to that podcast, you will then re-begin listening from where you left off. This is an incredible tool. But have I ever gone back to a 3-hour podcast and gone, I'm going to listen to the other 2.5 hours now? Of course I haven't, because the reason I checked out in the first place was because it was boring as shit after 30 minutes. Sorry for swearing. But it's just like, no one's coming back to that graveyard 2.5 hours of rubbish on the end of that conversation. And that's the number one thing that winds me up about all of this. It's all quite self-indulgent. That's my honest truth.
And you think men are more self-indulgent in podcasts than women?
Yes, they are.
Why? Why?
Woman who's got a 3-hour on the daily show. I can't even think of one. I can't. I'm sorry.
No, I can't either. No. I know you're absolutely right. I cannot think about any woman who has this. But I'm curious to why. Why is that from your perspective?
I just can't think what it is. I just don't know what it could be.
So what you're saying, that duration is extremely important as well. So when you have a topic, maybe it's succinct to communicate clearly so the audience can follow instead of, needing to stop and start and stop. Because usually nobody returns back. Once when they're gone most of the time, isn't it?
That's what I believe. I mean, I have another podcast called Amala Tierra. It is a podcast about ecology, farming, regenerative agriculture, the soil, subjects about Ibiza and the Balearics that are related to the health and wealth of our island. And I looked at it the other day and I have 100% retention rate. And it's not bigging myself up. It's just saying because, and I believe the reason for this is, it's broken up into 3 chunks of 20-minute interviews, which is kind of like a format that I'd heard on another podcast called Farmerama in England, which is only 3 times 10 minutes. And I think if you can break a conversation down into bite-sizable chunks and just take the best bits from all of those conversations and not have this 1 hour waffle, which is basically what most people do, I think the optimum listening time these days is less than 20 minutes. People get so bored, their attention span is minimal. They're not interested in hearing people bang on for hours and hours. They're really not. You know, if you think about before podcasting was born, you have blog pages, or you have YouTube channels. And if you look online at the stats for that, which is something I've studied quite a bit, you know, people listen to the first 60 seconds, maybe 3 minutes if you're lucky. If you do a Facebook Live or an Instagram Live, people pop in for like 60 seconds, 2 or 3 minutes. People don't have the capacity. Everyone's so overloaded with all of this stuff in our digital, you know, world that I just don't think that they have the attention span anymore. That's the honest truth of it.
Yeah.
And that's why podcasting is successful, because you're giving somebody something they're actually interested in, hopefully, that they can sit down or do other stuff whilst digesting and learning something and then dining out on that story later on in the evening and sounding really interesting at that dinner party.
Yeah. Is it like that you're listening? Because I'm listening like that. And sometimes I'm curious, is it only me who is listening? Because I listen to the podcast as a background sometimes. And then if something really captures my attention, I would stop doing what I'm doing and then I would focus back into it. And I was like, this is so interesting. I need to memorize this. Are you consuming or listening to the podcast in the same way? Or do you sit down with full attention?
I don't really like to multitask when I'm listening, actually. I used to be an amazing multitasker in my 40s. I'm suddenly realizing that's no longer a life skill that I possess. So that's interesting. But I often sit there with a pen and paper. You know, if it's something that I really, really want to hear, I will sit down and take notes for sure. And I think actually, you know, podcasts are the lazy bookworms, you know, way of learning, really. I mean, I often, if I want to learn something or I want information on something quickly, you know, I will just Google it in the podcast app and I will just start to, you know, research. For example, you know, you were asking me at the beginning, like, oh, how do I make a good podcast? I mean, do not sit down with somebody that you haven't done any research on. I mean, tedious, very, very, very uncool and disrespectful of your guest's time. And what is the number one way, apart from obviously going to Google News and tapping in their name and seeing if there's any articles that come up immediately about their activity in the recent past, is to go to the podcast app and listen to somebody else's podcast with them and just see how terrible it was and how much better that you can do and what other kinds of questions that you can ask them so you're not going to bore them senseless. You know, that's the number one piece of feedback that I tend to get from my guests is like, really loved your questions. Like, you really impressed me, the fact that you'd spent so much time, you know. And I think that if you're going to really, really engage a listener and keep them with you into the next episode and the rest of the series, what's that one question that you can absolutely astound your guest with the fact that you found and absolutely have them completely on the back foot? And, you know, that's when it gets really interesting, when the tumbleweed starts to blow past and your guest is really thinking about what they're going to say. And, you know, there's nothing wrong with having a chat to somebody, but if you are going to have a chat, I still think that you're going to take up an hour of somebody's day and you really want them to commit to doing that hour, then you need to have some good little bits of dynamite up your sleeve. You really do.
Absolutely. So I'm
dynamite now. I'm ready.
Exactly. I'm going to surprise you now. I'm not going to be like all other men or self-indulgent. We're not going to continue for another 2 hours. So let's wrap up because we already. So I'm just going to break the stereotype, or maybe you can leave and I can just stay by myself and keep on talking. Maybe I'll do that. And then in 2 hours' time, when you finish your Christmas lunch, you come back and say something profound. Don't you think?
You'll be there still.
I'm just going to still be there and talk, and I'm going to talk to my invisible audience. Anyway, how would you love to leave the audience? What do you think is the key message for you? If you were to land something very specific for people who are listening to our conversation so far, what would that be for you?
I just don't think you should underestimate the power of podcasting. I think that it's such an incredible platform. If you have genuinely really got a message and something that you want to get out there, and you feel that you need to share and it's your life's calling, absolutely, you should start a podcast. But, you know, I do feel that those moments and those memories and bits of gold are there and still up for grabs and, you know, there for the taking. If you can really provide somebody with something out of the ordinary, very valuable. And I think, you know, this little takeaway section at the end is really important for somebody to go, okay, now I've wrapped my head around the last 30 minutes. It's almost like a TED talk. It's like, how can I, summarize all these wonderful little snippets and bits and pieces into something that I can take into my day and apply in either a conversation or my work scenario or whatever. And I think that, that doesn't diminish, the last 30 minutes that you've listened to. But I think wrapping up and summarizing and giving somebody something concise is much better, as I said before, than going on for hours and hours. So, I think everybody, has the possibility to write a book or start a podcast, but just not everybody should.
I love that. I just love how we added this. Thank you, Jo, so much. Thank you. Thank you for your wisdom. So, thank you for your clarity, and also thank you for being so real. Sometimes, when you talk to people about the topic of their expertise, and something is so hot like a podcast, that we all would love to believe that we can all be podcasters all the time. We need to be real about what is necessary and what is needed for somebody to begin producing it in a good way so that people can listen, because the final outcome, right, is you want audience that engages. No matter if you have millions and millions of followers or a small group of people who are dedicated and love the topic and they're following you anyway. So thank you for that. Thank you for being real. Are you going to do any of the podcast education in a due time in 2024?
I am. I do have another course coming up on the 11th and 12th of January. So, that is, as I said before, I do feel a bit responsible sometimes for launching things that maybe shouldn't be launched. But I also feel that, it was always my life calling before I kind of got into radio to maybe teach young people how to make audio programs and do it well. So for me to be able to share a little bit of that magic on the course is great. And that is going to be happening again in the new year. So yes.
Wonderful. So we're going to reference this and give the listeners the website we can find and enroll and register, and they can already feel that you're a fantastic teacher who is real and authentic and will tell us how the things really are. And then we can really learn. I don't like when people are wrapping it up in nice things, but people don't understand what's really going on with this medium. Thank you so much once again for coming and sparkling your Christmas magic for the audience. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening. This was a fun show. I really love and enjoy being with Jo, and I hope that you got a lot of the goodies out of it that you can apply into your life, into your work and beyond. Thank you so much for tuning in.